All right, good afternoon. So I'm Danny Bartlett, London Club, alternate. I'm also extremely excited to be the chair of the convention, and it is my honor now to introduce our lunchtime speaker. So I'm going to share a tiny bit about me before I introduce her. So I am a proud mom and a proud union activist, a proud trade unionist. So I'm super excited to introduce our next speaker. Siobhán Vipond, I should have asked you how to say that. I'm just gonna, is the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. Since being elected to the 29th Constitutional Convention in 2021, Siobhán has been committed trade unionist and an intersectional feminist committed to fair and equitable work. She's an advocate for workers' rights, pension, gender, and racial equity, and the importance of workers' voices at all levels of government and industry. Prior to her election at the CLC, she served 4 elected terms as Secretary-Treasurer of the Alberta Federation of Labour, and she's a proud member of IATSE. Welcome. I will just add that it's pretty exciting in the labour movement to see some fierce feminists taking the lead. So welcome. You're welcome.
Got all excited at lunch and took my jacket off. It's so wonderful to be here with you. You'd be surprised with a name spelt Siobhán how many people stumble when they see my last name, because I think they're surprised how simple it looks. But yeah, thank you for including me here. And I'd like to start by recognizing and honor that we are gathered here today on Takaranto, right, which is the unceded, unsurrendered territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and acknowledge the important diverse First Nations that exist here amongst us and we share space with, which of course are the Inuit, Métis, as well as the First Nations people. And the Canadian Labour Congress respects and affirms the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across the land. And we will continue to honor these commitments of self-determination and sovereignty we have made to Indigenous peoples and nations. And we say this at the beginning of all of our speeches as part of the Truth and Reconciliation process, which is an extremely personal commitment that we all must make on that path through reconciliation. So it is such a pleasure to be here. Now, I know many of you may not know the Canadian Labour Congress. We are Canada's largest labour organization. We represent 3 million workers made up of about 55 unions, which are both national and international. We began in 1956, and through that time, we have always pushed to represent workers and to raise the floor, as we like to say, not just for unionized workers, but for all workers. And we do this work through collective bargaining, but we also do it through lobbying and working with partner organizations and like-minded people so that we can improve the lives of all Canadians through work. And we will, have many examples of unions fighting for issues such as we have parental leave and maternity leave and in part our healthcare system, as well as most recently gender violence leave in Canada, because unions first fought for it in their workplaces, and then we did that work to make sure that all workers have access to that. Yeah. Unionized workers in Canada are majority of women. We are made up of the majority of women, and it is an exciting time in the labor movement over the last few years, as now the leadership is also becoming a majority of women for the first time in its history. 3 of the 4 officers at the CLC level last year, as you said, were elected, are women. We have a woman president, woman secretary-treasurer, and I'm one of the women vice presidents. And we know that only matters if we exercise our intersectional femininity as we lead these organizations. But you will also see in unions across Canada who have not traditionally been led by women, that is also happening, which is extremely exciting. And so obviously, having kind of a basis of where I'm coming from is, always important for us to build these bridges. And so some of this work that we do internationally, we do alongside with BPW. I remember first hearing and, someone saying, oh, this opportunity to come speak to BPW, and I was like, okay, well, who are they? And as soon as I saw the piece of paper with the logo, I was like, oh, I know who they are, because I've been at the UN Commission on the Status of Women for the last 6-ish years, 5-ish years, and of course you have a presence there, and of course I knew who you were. I just maybe got overwhelmed with all the acronyms we have in our world. And so it's no secret that, that the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact and it's hurt women the most, especially those who face other forms of discrimination and marginalization, which includes young, Black, Indigenous, racialized women, newcomers, women with disabilities, and queer and trans, and those part of the queer and trans communities. And so here in Canada, that has actually translated to historic 30-year low in women's participation in the labor force. And after more than 1.5 million women have lost their jobs, and many more have reduced hours or lost their income at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, stories of job loss, reduction of hours, pivots to new careers and entrepreneurship, is a positive side of it, but it's all while continuing to juggle the lion's share of work responsibilities at home. And this was, part of the dominant narrative of what happened to women during this pandemic. And we heard one of the speakers to one of your resolutions speak to this. Now, of course, obviously we want to recognize the positive, right? Some of you here, I'm sure, are a testament to success stories of new careers and new businesses that have resulted in this kind of pivoting and, that women did during the pandemic. But overwhelmingly, women bore the brunt of the economic downturn that happened due to COVID-19. And at the point, and that also points to the importance that our recovery is human-centered, it's worker-centered, and it's women in all of their diversity-centered. Because as we look forward, and many of us are fortunate to be seeing this as the recovery period, and as was recognized before lunch, so many people we know we are not past this, and so the recovery also has to acknowledge what that looks like. So when we start, we want to look at those at the front lines of the crisis, right? These are the healthcare workers, long-term care workers, nurses, educators, the child care providers, and a whole bunch of other people in the paid care economy. And while they've been keeping our community safe, fed, healthy, and supported, they have been facing increased risk of exposure to the virus. They have higher risk to violence and harassment, and inadequate access to personal protective equipment, which is happening to this day, and of course, access or a lack of access to paid sick days. And so as they're in the midst of it, we need to all continue to improve those so that we can get to where everybody is in a recovery period. The people in this sector are also, increasingly overworked, they're underpaid, and they do not get the respect and the support they receive from our governments. And so the care economy in Canada is about 20% of our economy in whole, which is huge. And often we don't talk about it as one big item. And so what ends up happening, it gets parsed out, it gets, like hodgepodge and piece by piece, versus looking at it as this large, needed, important, integral part of our economy. So overwhelmingly, it is the caring labor of women, both paid and unpaid, that is making it so that our economy can weather and our communities can weather the impacts of this pandemic. And so that's from those who have left paid work to care for children and support education, right, due to the school closures. It's to those who re-entered the workforce to help meet the demands of the stretched healthcare system. And it's care work that keeps things moving in our economy, seemingly, everything else screeched to a halt. But care continued to happen throughout the pandemic. And however, it is important for us to recognize that and to call people, recognize that work, but it needs to be more than just a thank you, right? It has to be more than just recognizing those commitments and sacrifices. We actually have to put in place systemic changes to support those workers. And so we are calling on our federal and provincial governments to address the care crisis by growing the care sector with good jobs that value women's labor appropriately and ensure care services are in place. And, because we need to reduce and redistribute women's heavy and disproportionate load of unpaid work. And again, someone spoke about this this morning, because according to the ILO, and I think most of you are probably aware, which is the International Labor Organization, it's the it's the only tripartite agency of the UN, which brings together governments, employers, and workers together to improve working conditions, to make labor standards, and to push for good jobs for all. And according to the ILO, women perform 76% of unpaid care work globally, 76% globally. And so this is quite honestly unsustainable, and studies have shown women are struggling with the pandemic, right? It's adding stress, it's impacting mental health, and it's threatening women's economic security. We were talking earlier, I don't have COVID, I've been testing, but my throat is a little bit froggy. And so here in Canada, we need a coherent strategy to care and increase investments in the care services and supports that people and families need, they rely on. And so this includes good jobs, and we say that often, but it is extremely important because making more bad jobs is actually making the problem worse, right? This is about good jobs that offer benefits and, decent, fair compensation based on the value of the work, right? The care work has value, and we need to recognize that. And so this means, strengthening existing public services. It means making investments and growth in new public services that, so that the labor of caring for each other is not so heavily reliant on women doing unpaid work. And so in Canada, we're calling on the federal government to create a care economy commission so that we can study and recommend a strategy to address this crisis. Because, as I said, it is divided, it's all over the map, so what does it look like? Because comprehensive care policies will yield positive health, economic, and gender equality outcomes. It'll benefit children, parents, older persons, as well as persons living with disabilities. And a care strategy is critical if we want to ensure an equitable and gender-just economic recovery. And so we have been recently focusing our work on the listening to the people who are providing care, that is paid, that is unpaid. And we have a care campaign going on, and we want to hear those stories. And we get a lot of submissions, which is wonderful. And I just want to share one with you, which is from Tess, who is a personal support worker from Ontario. And her journey to becoming an advocate for workers in the care economy kind of helps to illustrate some of the real life stresses and pressures that people are feeling. So Tess was born and raised in the Philippines and migrated to Canada 20 years ago. She worked hard to gain an education and become a personal support worker, and quickly rose up the ranks of becoming a leader in her union. And as a representative of workers of color and women in her workforce, Tess's advocacy highlighted that care workers' poor conditions in the workplace have only gotten worse since the pandemic began. And so in her own words, when the pandemic struck, the world changed. But despite this change, we stood beside vulnerable residents. We shielded our patients. We worked endlessly and tirelessly. We struggled to find appropriate protection. The lack of information from both employers and government was truly frustrating and scary. Sometimes when I left my house, I would ask myself if this was the last day to hold and see my family. And I should not be feeling this way. Our care system is broken and forgotten, and it's been ignored for decades. This is the time for change and investments for the future and for the next generation. And so we share stories that we hear because we know the numbers, but if we are not listening, we are not going to learn on how to improve this. And it is people like Tess in our labor movement that have been motivating us but leading the charge in terms of what we need to do to change. Because women's involvement in care work, and this is unpaid care work in particular, is a critical factor shaping women's employment, career, and earning trajectories, and the quality of their working life, right? StatsCan estimates the value of unpaid childcare provided by parents in Canada in 2015 was about $284 billion. And 2015 was, well, 100 years ago, but also 7 years ago. And of that care, women provided about 60% of unpaid childcare and other unpaid household activities in that same year, which is compared to 40% of men. Now, these stats are very binary, but we do acknowledge that there's also people who do not fall into that, but we look at it here to see the effects it's having on women and also the effects it's having on men. And unlike in other countries, the hours spent on unpaid childcare is actually increasing in Canada. And we should all be concerned about what the impact that's going to be on gender equity. And so, together with the lack of affordable childcare, the responsibility that women carry for child rearing and caring for family members generally, forces many women to make to work part-time, to work in precarious, informal employment, and forego paid employment altogether. Now, sometimes this is put in front of us as people making choices, but if you have no options in front of you, it is not a choice. It is something that you're being pushed into, and the stats and the research show that this is not about women choosing to raise their children. This is about women having no other opportunity in front of them that is realistic, while also bearing the responsibility of their families. And so this has a negative effect of limiting, lifetime earnings for women. It limits their wealth accumulation, their retirement savings, and access to benefits, not to mention access to training and vocational and learning opportunities, to career advancement, and for the chances for promotion. Now, on the other hand, men's lower levels of unpaid work are an important factor in their superior outcomes with respect to career prospects, in their lifetime earnings and wealth, and their quality of working life. So the reality is that we will all need care at some point in our life, have needed it, will need it, and so it is vital. It is skilled, and it is life-sustaining work that supports our families, economy, and communities. And so, but it is also unacceptable that the majority of this work continues to be performed by women, and that so much of it is still unpaid. If we truly want to achieve gender equality and build more equitable workplaces, and by extension, a more equitable society, then addressing the importance of care work and calling for greater support for care workers and investments in Canada's care system must be a centerpiece of this recovery. And when we're addressing women's economic recovery in the wake of COVID, it also means addressing the rampant rates of violence and harassment that women and gender diverse individuals face in workplaces, because work must be safe. And so recently we did a Pan-Canada survey from us, and we had research partners at Western University, and we found that women and gender diverse workers are experiencing astronomically high rates of harassment and violence at work. This pushes women out of the workforce and increases their economic precarity. We found that nearly 4 out of 5 women experience some form of non-sexual harassment and violence at work. 4 out of 5. And that nearly half of women experience sexual harassment and violence at work. Now, these rates are even higher for Indigenous and racialized workers, women with disabilities, the members of the 2S LGBTQI communities, because they're more likely to experience ongoing harassment and violence and face increased barriers to reporting. And the pervasive nature of this harassment, coupled with the significant barriers to reporting, has had major impacts on women's ability to stay in the workforce. From our survey results, nearly 90% of workers who had experienced harassment and violence said it resulted in lost shifts, schedule changes against their will, denied promotions, and resulted them in either being fired or leaving the job. Women's economic security relies on us tackling the issue of harassment and violence at work. And that's why we at the Canadian Labour Congress are urging the government to ratify the International Labour Organization Convention 190. So this is ILO C-190. This is the first international standard to recognize a worker's right to work free from harassment and violence, and a right that is necessary for women to enter and stay in the workforce. And now more than ever, we need to access the tools provided in C-190 to guarantee that women workers are not left behind in the economic recovery plan. And Canada has yet to ratify this. This is lobbying work that is ongoing for us, and we will continue to do that work. But it is absolutely so important that, again, as someone this morning was saying, is that on a different issue, but we say one thing internationally and we practice something different at home. And I think that's upon all of us as activists and advocates to push so that those things match for the betterment of everybody. So paid sick leave is also a critical issue for all workers, but especially for women workers. And I think we talked about paid sick leave in a way during COVID that maybe many people in Canada had never spoken about it. But the idea of going to your, grocery store or going to a restaurant or going anywhere and that someone was forced to go to work sick, I think became a little bit more scary during those times. And the reason why it's such an important issue for women is that because women are often the caregivers for family members who fall ill, having that flexibility to support and look after themselves as well as loved ones is critically necessary for paid workers. And we know that EI is a system that has worked very well for this and should work very well this, and it is currently undergoing a review. And so from the standpoint of women's economic justice, as well as benefit access, advocacy, and accountability to all workers, the reform is badly needed. The program continues to discriminate against women in very damaging ways. For instance, in 1996, reforms to the EI program replaced weeks of work with hours of work as the criterion for eligibility. And at the same time, it dramatically raised the work time requirements. Now, this change tends to discriminate against women who disproportionately work part-time or short work weeks in sectors like retail, accommodation, and food services, right, that are located in large urban centers with low unemployment rates. And so the EI rules also limit the combination of special benefits like maternity, parental, sickness, or caring for others, and unemployment benefits, and it limits unemployment benefits to a maximum of 50 weeks. Now, because women's disproportionate burden of caring work means that they claim the majority of special benefits, the 50-week limit on combined special and unemployed benefits negatively impacts women more than men. Women who lose their jobs before, during, or shortly after taking maternity or parental leave are just as unemployed as anybody else. And so in January 2022, the Social Security Tribunal issued a decision that was particularly welcome news and very important to women, right? So it avoided the EI's Act's sections that prevented women from combining regular and special benefits. And then, we also had the decision to expand EI sickness benefits from 15 to 26 weeks, which we welcomed because we saw what that is. Now, during COVID, right, the emergency income support benefit that existed for people that we, call CERB. Well, it changed names. We call it CERB now. But it also demonstrated the power of really well-designed social safety nets. Because by providing a flat rate benefit, when the EI program had to be bypassed in the crisis, right? It was like, get money in people's hands quickly or the economy is going to completely crash, right? And so the CERB's minimum weekly benefit meant that the traditional gap between men and women's EI benefits, it narrowed significantly. And EI effectively, it makes it difficult, right, for many part-time workers, again, disproportionately women, to qualify for EI. And so since many of these part-timers are also low paid, EI benefits are a percentage, so they also end up being low. And the CERB benefit effectively overcame all of those obstacles and had really positive impact on women's economic stability, I'm going to say, during but also, during COVID, but also recognizing that, it was very unstable even with that added there. So when we fight for, the reform in EI, we have much work to do, but establishing weekly individual benefit floor will be important to overcoming some of the disadvantages that women workers face under the EI program. And so we continue to do that work. And we do it with a gendered lens because when we build these programs to solve a problem and think that it's fair, if we don't look at it as again, to see how it's affecting women in all their diversity, then what we can do is build a system that is piling on. And so, I invite all of you in the audience who are employers to recognize that you have a unique and often untapped opportunity to work with workers and worker representatives, right, whether that's union or non-union, to ensure that there's the equitable recovery that meets the needs of the people who are most impacted. And, this can include working together with existing or prospective workers in your given industry to create strategies for recruitment, retention, and advancement that prioritizes employment equity for women workers. And, if we are going to seriously tackle gender inequalities in the labor market, as we rebuild our economy, employers are going to need to commit to taking action, and that's both short and long-term solutions, and it's to put women at the center and create lasting positive change. And so this is where I think women business owners and entrepreneurs can lead by example and also speak out about what they're doing that is working and that is actually contributing to this positive change. And because, this recovery has to be equitable and it has to be sustainable. And so, returning to the theme of this convention is the expanding possibilities together, because women have a very bright future everywhere in the labor movement. And I know women, we have historically come together in unions to combat sexism, gender discrimination, and exclusion in the workplace. And we have transformed our unions in the process, and we have transformed the labor movement. And so building solidarity is extremely important to the work we do, and the collective power to expand possibilities is exactly what unions are built for. And quite honestly, we have not done this work alone, right? The important and long-standing collaborations between labor movement and feminist organizations like the BPW have worked to advance gender equality and women's economic justice internationally and here at home. And so together we have won important victories, right? We have new legislation on pay equity legislation. We have groundbreaking funding to support the development of a national childcare system. And we must continue to work together to address how violence and harassment shows up in the workplace. We have to push the government and employers to recognize the importance of protecting workers, especially frontline workers, who are more often women, right, from abuse and harassment. And so we need to, and we need action to address the challenges of sexism, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism at work and in our communities. And we need to meaningfully account for the care responsibilities that too often limit women's employment opportunities and lifetime pension contributions, and therefore their economic independence. So progressive change happens when we unite and we work together. And so let's continue that long, history of solidarity and build a strong future for women at work. And so I would like to say thank you. And I look forward to the work we can do together because this can only move up when you have a room with this much energy and excitement. So thank you.
So, I would like to thank you for coming.
Oh,
We have a
thank
little
you. That's
gift from you.
beautiful.
This came from our Indigenous Centre in London, Ontario.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And then when we talk about expanding possibilities, I will just sort of challenge the women in the room. Every one of our provinces has a federation of labor. Almost all of our communities will have a labor council. And in those councils, you'll find women like myself and Siobhán who are dedicated to doing the work. It was very exciting. You got to see a couple of our resolutions pass. And so having folks in your community that will take your resolutions and help you lobby them and stand behind, the BPW women in the community as we lobby and get these resolutions where they need to go really does expand our possibilities. So thank you.